All right, so I would like to introduce now the next speaker, Carolyn. She is actually coming from Berlin, especially for the conference, so we're really thankful. This is also actually a group of speakers flying in from different cities, so that's a huge thank you. So a little bit about Carolyn. I know she's a journalist and also a JavaScript developer. And I think you can now understand why this topic, humanizing your documentation, because as a journalist, she has the talent to actually make things readable. So please, round of applause, and we start. Woo!
Cool, thank you for coming. Hopefully you can read it with the light on. But yeah, as Jeanette mentioned, I'm Carolyn. I'm a front-end developer based in Berlin, and before that, I was actually a technical writer, so this topic is very near and dear to my heart. And so I'm going to be talking to you about documentation, and for the sake of this talk, we're going to be talking about external-facing documentation, so information that describes your product to its users. And I want to start off with a question. Why do we even write documentation? Is it because our competitors have it? Or because someone told us to do it? Or is it because we really want to help the people using our products accomplish their goals? It should be the last, but more often than not, it's not. And writing documentation is often an afterthought. It's something that we just get done. But what if we gave documentation the same time and consideration that we do the products we ship? So use case-driven documentation derives from the idea of goal-driven documentation, which were both coined and made popular by Tyner Blaine in 2006. And it works like this. Make your users' goals the focal point of your documentation, instead of just describing interface elements from left to right. And a way to highlight this is with a power drill. So if we were going to document this drill the same way that most people document software, we could end up with something like this. How to adjust the speed, how to change the direction of the drill, and how to change the drill bit. So now you know how to operate a drill, but you don't know how to actually accomplish anything with it. And these are examples of reference documentation. They're information-oriented. They describe the machinery. And they're almost always accurate and complete. But what if we reshape our thinking a little bit and think about what it takes to do the job and not just use the tool? We could end up with something like this. How to drill a hole in a flat surface, whether it's wood or metal. How to select the right screw for fastening items. How to stir paint with your drill. Suddenly, the documentation is helping us achieve our goals. And these guides are goal-oriented. They show how to solve a specific problem, and they're usually listed out in a series of steps. But why is this approach successful? Well, to begin to understand that, we need to think about that first question. Why do we even write documentation? And perhaps more importantly, who do we write documentation for? And this answer is surprisingly straightforward. Humans. Yeah, I know. With like the advancement of, sophisticated bots and AI, like this answer could change pretty soon. But for now, most software documentation is written with the idea that human beings are going to read it. And human beings need that guidance and caring that documentation is meant to provide. And that's why these same principles for the drill can actually apply to our products. We aren't writing documentation necessarily to teach someone how to work our software, but rather we're trying to teach them how to achieve their goals and solve their problems using our software. And now let's apply this idea to something more relevant to our industry. Say Slack. So Slack is a cloud-based set of team collaboration tools and services, and because I know they have a developer portal and thorough documentation, I decided to take a look and see what I could find. And these are a few of the titles that I found within their documentation. So they have those information-oriented reference docs that we talked about earlier. And they teach us how to add a bot user to our Slack app, programming those bot users, and how to subscribe to the event types via their Events API. That's nice, sure, But perhaps if I'm a first-time Slack user, I'm still not sure how or why I would even need to do this. So this is a screenshot from the same documentation portal, but just a different page. And now notice how they're giving us examples of use cases, creating simple workflows or building bots. And they're outlining what we can accomplish, creating a simple workflow by completing simple tasks like requests and approvals, or maybe building a bot that can talk to our users directly. And it actually points you to that same reference documentation that we saw before. And now that we understand or have a better idea of what use case-driven documentation is, let's create a high-level outline of this idea. So when you develop a use case, you typically start with a goal. Then if you're using use case-driven development or something similar, your workflow could end up looking something like this. You'll define the functional requirements, you'll design the product, and then you'll implement the feature. And this is called a structured requirements approach, and with an approach like this, we've already solved half the problem, figuring out what to document. The issue is that most people begin their documentation at this point, at the implementation phase, once the feature is already done. And, this is okay. It works. The documentation gets done. But what a use case-driven approach is suggesting is that we start at, you probably guessed it, the use case. And the beauty of this is that you can design your documentation simultaneously with the features that you're developing. And when you use a structured requirements approach, we have an established framework for defining the problems that our users might face and the problems that our software will actually solve. And we can articulate how to identify and solve those problems through a use case. And then those use cases, as I mentioned, define what we should document. But as you guessed it, it's not that simple. So there's some problems with this use case-driven approach. First of all, it takes a fundamental change to how your team structures and completes their documentation. And not to mention, this sounds more like a beautiful ideal and not really something that we face day in and day out. And those reference docs, the one that just describe the machinery or how things should work, they're actually kind of the reason that documentation has such a bad reputation in our industry, because they tend to be a bit dry and they leave us wanting more. And personally, I know this feeling all too well, because even if I have written technical content for a living, I still to this day have a pretty unsatisfying relationship with documentation. And this was especially clear a little over a year ago, and after 2 years working in tech, when I decided to take the dive and learn to program. And I knew exactly at that time what I wanted to learn. I wanted to learn JavaScript. And yes, React. But I mean, I don't know how you guys felt like while you were new and learning, but every day I was asking myself something like, what's going on? In my terminal, in my text editor. I didn't really understand what was happening. Am I the only person who finds this confusing? Because I know there are thousands of people who work with JavaScript, and they seem to be thriving and doing really well, and while I'm sitting here struggling. And do people actually enjoy this? And will I ever think that building stuff with JavaScript is actually fun? I mean, spoiler alert, I do now. But it felt like at the beginning, in order to do any of the interesting things with JavaScript, you needed to know the advanced features. And I was really struggling to learn those. And the most detrimental part, I believe, to my learning was the documentation I was finding. Because it was supposed to be fueling my learning and getting me going. But it was actually really stunting it. More often than not, I left documentation feeling defeated and deflated, and my questions were still unanswered. And the thing is, I'm not alone. I'm sure there are people out in the audience who understand. Documentation is one of the largest pain points to developers, and if you just search the term reading documentation on Twitter, you'll find out that most of the tweets, they're not so nice. And here are some of my favorites that I found within the last month. Hi, I was reading your documentation, and you described the data in 2 different ways, which is correct. Thank you. The way it works is actually third completely different description. Nothing like spending a day reading a 137-page PDF for CMS documentation. Puts head down on desk and cries. I would too. And this one's my personal favorite. Bad documentation is bad. And even after someone else asked this person, if there were no docs, would it really be better? She still said, deep thoughts. Honestly, yes, because it would waste less of my time. So yeah, people love to hate documentation. But can you blame them? I mean, I also think it has to be on us, the developers, the technical writers, whoever is contributing to your documentation, because we don't actually treat our readers that well most of the time. I mean, look at the term users. I mean, I'm guilty. I use this term all the time. I've used it in this talk right now. But Laura Kalbag, who is a designer and accessibility advocate, she explains it really well. She says that I tend to not even refer to people as users. I refer to them just as people who use things. And she explains that this is because when we say users, as developers, designers, what have you, we're separating ourselves. We turn the people who use our products and read our documentation into this kind of faraway thing that we don't have to think about. And we don't necessarily think of them as people who are just like us. And that's why, like, when I was working as a technical writer, I had to constantly remind our developers that, you know, we're writing for humans. And not just that, though, we're writing for humans who don't even want to be reading your documentation in the first place. Like, people don't typically visit documentation, you know, read it for pleasure or leisure. Most of the time when people come to documentation, they're frustrated with your software. They're really disappointed that they haven't been able to solve the problem on their own. And, you know, generally, they're feeling pretty low. And I understand that reality isn't awesome. It's not great. And especially if you are someone who does put a lot of love and consideration into your docs. But being aware of these negative feelings that people might be experiencing at your documentation is key. Because these emotions frame the reader's perspective, and therefore, they should shape the mood of our documentation. Now, let's take a step back and think about, you know, back when I was beginning, what were some of the issues with the documentation that I found, or even that I still find today? Much of it is disorienting. The underlying structure was difficult to follow. The titles didn't necessarily match what the guide was going to teach me. Or in some cases, they just weren't accessible. I literally couldn't read them because of the way the app was structured. They were alienating. Some documentation I read made me feel super isolated afterwards. There were words or concepts that were, you know, quote unquote, assumed knowledge that I didn't have, and they were never explained. Not to mention the use of, you know, gendered or any other discriminatory language. And finally, they were confusing. And it was clear that the developers working on the features I was reading about had such a depth of knowledge. They knew so much about this topic. But it wasn't exactly translating to me as a brand new user. Now, let's run through some of these common issues that I found. I'll show you some examples of what not to do, followed by some tools and role models to maybe help us all do a little bit better. And all of the what not to do examples are actually like live on the internet, but I'm not trying to make too many like enemies during this talk, so I anonymized them a little bit using the drill example from earlier. So the first issue, as I mentioned earlier, poorly defined structure. The structure of our documentation is important because they shape the learning journey and overall experience for our readers. And if the structure is not defined well, you can lose control of how the readers interpret your work. So here's one of those not so great examples. Like, Here's a short story for getting up and running quickly with your drill. 1, read the documentation. 2, read the documentation. 3, remember that you were warned twice about reading the documentation. Like, I had to put a screenshot because I was like, this is actually on the internet. And I can't make that up. And it's crazy because I'm like, aren't I in the documentation if I'm reading this? And it also then goes on to list every single command that's available for this tool. And it's particularly bad because, it's in a getting started guide, which is the first impression. So how we can combat this? Mindful structure. Whether it's one particular article or throughout your entire documentation app that you develop, we want to have a clear, easy-to-follow structure. And when in doubt, just follow something like this. Talk about one specific feature. Go on to explain the use cases. And finally, then offer solutions for toolings, integrations, etc. And this covers all of your bases. It has those information-oriented documentation. It has the goal-oriented guides. And plus, you can plug other tools or lead the reader to the next article that you want them to see. The next issue is unexpected errors. Have you ever, been developing something and you see something like, just run this line and you're good to go. But then when you run it in your terminal, it just like, I don't know, there's just like red blotches everywhere, nothing works. Yeah, so unfortunately that's really common. And when error messages do come up, they often look like this. We have lost connection to our server and disabled editing features. Please verify that you have internet access. This literally tells me nothing. And all I know is that I need to check my connection, but I don't really get why my editing features are disabled, and is it really my connection that went down, or was it theirs? It's kind of unclear. So what we can do is we can consider and address common errors that our readers might face. And this helps to reassure to your users that, 1, mistakes happen, things, errors are going to happen, things go wrong. And it also provides options for troubleshooting. And when you're writing these messages about errors, you want to try to explain what happened and why, as well as what to do next. So here's a better solution for our mishap earlier. It appears that you aren't connected to the internet at the moment. The fields are temporarily locked so that you won't lose any important changes. This tells you what happened. The fields are locked. It tells you why it happened. It's because you have no internet connection. And its implications, so that you won't lose your changes. Here's another good example. And yes, this is a screenshot from the Apple II Basic Programming Manual from, yes, the 1970s. But it tackles the nuances of common user errors quite well. And it even explains syntax errors before they have you write a line of code. And so in this example, it tells you what happened. You got a beep, and then the syntax error message. Why? Because we pressed return. And what to do next. It literally just says, ignore this message. And when you're formatting these errors, these error alerts, particularly in tutorials, Django Girls is a great resource to reference. These notes, like the ones down here, are scattered throughout the tutorial, and the clear formatting enables it to be informative without being distracting to people who might, not be experiencing those errors. A lot of other techniques I've seen is like making it collapsible. So, if you're experiencing this error, click here, and then it gives you a description of what to do next. All right, then insensitive language. This one's a little tricky because across nationalities and personalities, this can mean so many different things. And, in this case, I'm talking about, gendered language, profanity, racial slurs, or anything kind of along those lines. For instance, if a programmer wishes to uphold the invariant, he must satisfy the function's preconditions. I hate reading stuff like this because as a woman in tech, I already feel a little bit isolated. And then on top of that, when I read something like this, I feel like this wasn't, this wasn't for me. And then also, this guide in this guide, I will show you 3 main ways to hide your shit. Yeah, that won't necessarily go over well with everyone. And these both are relatively tame examples, I know, but you'd be surprised what you can find. and they won't necessarily all go over well in your community. So what we can do is we can think before we type. A good rule to follow is that when you're documenting code, don't make assumptions or implications about, the race, the gender, the religion, political orientation, or anything else that really isn't relevant to software development within your docs. Or you can have a linter do it for you. So AlexJS catches insensitive and polarizing writing within your markdown files and suggests helpful alternatives. You can use it as a command line tool or as an integration to your favorite text editor or even on Slack. And it's open source, so if you, notice it's not catching something, you can contribute. So here are those 2 sentences from earlier plugged into the AlexJS web app. And yeah, it's highlighting those words that are probably better left out of our documentation. And as a suggestion, you should still probably have like a real human read over it, preferably someone who's not from, the same nationality or gender as you. But this is a good first step. Not saying simply or easy. So really, after fixing a bug for hours, do you really want to read something that's just like, oh yeah, but this is so easy? That's not so nice. So James Harrison Fisher gave an entire talk at Write the Docs London about just the word simply. And at one point, he searched simply on GitHub and found over 92 million references to it in documentation. And most of the examples, not so simple. For instance, simply connect the HTTP endpoint at api.mydrill.com. And that was it. It's like, OK, but how? Next, we simply start parsing an expression. And afterwards, if the next token is a colon and the expression was a simple identifier node, then da-da-da-da-da-da. It just keeps going. And it says simply and simple. I don't know. It doesn't sound so simple to me. So my solution, don't say it. But don't worry. I have a little bit more for you than that. So Write Good is another linter for English prose, and it's available on the command line as well. And it checks for general grammar and all of that, but it also, once it's installed, you can run this command, and it will do a general check on your markdown files. And it automatically flags the words simply and easily. And you can also, create custom checks. So if there's any words that you use commonly, like just or easy, then you can plug those right in. The next issue I run into a lot is bloated language. And this is like those overly complicated prose that are really difficult to understand, and particularly if you're reading documentation that isn't in your native language. And here's an example. OK. This approach will work for our specific use case, but if we haven't achieved the objective of truly encapsulating the behavior in a reusable way. Now, every time we want the drill position for a different use case, we have to create a new component, i.e. essentially another drill with screw, that renders something specifically for that use case. And that's just 2 sentences. So an alternative is to use plain language. We want to choose our language intentionally. And using plain language is crucial for creating more inclusive and accessible documentation. And again, don't worry, I have a linter for you. So Hemingway app is a tool that you can copy and paste your text into, and it will highlight problematic words and sentences, plus offer you suggestions for how to change it. Yeah, it's available as a web app or a linter, or also, I believe, a command line tool, but I could be wrong. In this case, it has identified that first sentence as, first and second sentence as difficult to read, and it's hard to see, but it highlighted other words that could either have a more simple alternative or that are just not necessary. And our sentence right now is about a grade 12, according to Hemingway, and we want to aim for about a grade 8 or 9. And please don't worry about, the grade level or whatever being too low, because as the great Ashley Bischoff says, no one has ever complained that something was too easy to read. All right, almost there. The next issue, you're in too deep. When you're working as a developer, documentation can be hard because you're so deep and focused into that product, and specifically that feature that you're developing. And so what often happens is that when you're writing documentation, you'll write it as if you're talking to yourself. But the problem is that first-time users won't have that same frame of reference. And so any unexplained term or skip step in the process will really throw them off. So something to remember is that everyone is a beginner at some point. No matter how intuitive you think your app is, there's still going to be people who struggle with it in the beginning. So my suggestion is to take a step back. What I've found to be effective, both as a developer myself and when I was helping developers as a technical writer, was once you finish, go through the entire process and talk out loud with someone who's not working on the same project. And at the same time, that colleague can be taking notes and asking you questions and fill in those gaps that might be unclear. And finally, your product just isn't the right fit. So another confusing issue that occurs frequently is that the tool that that someone's trying to use, it just doesn't work for their use case. So what we can do is we can be transparent. And when you know that something doesn't work for a specific use case, say so, tell them. You'll save people a lot of headaches in the long run. And also in your introduction material, it helps to iterate over the fact that double check that this tool is appropriate for what you need it for. A great example of this is the reason documentation. On their converting from JavaScript page, they emphasize that you should make sure that reason fits your needs. And it also points out that you shouldn't, quote unquote, unnecessarily thrash your colleagues over languages and frameworks, but for the record, that's always unnecessary. All right. So I hope I've given you a new tool or maybe something to add to your documentation checklist. But before I get off the stage, I want to leave you with something that I learned during my time as a technical writer. So I was working for a company called Contentful. And when I first read through their style guide, something really struck me. At the beginning, it says, we aim for accuracy and consistency. Sure, this is the case for most documentation. But what really got me was what came next. We want to aim to be honest, helpful, and human. Honest in the sense that we communicate the pros and cons, and by doing so, we build trust. We want to be helpful. We want our users to succeed, because ultimately, their success is our success. And we want to be human. We want it to feel familiar and approachable. I mean, after all, you and anyone else writing or reading your docs are all humans too. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would now invite you to sit on the special chairs. And somebody has to tell me how to do the magic with the... Okay.
Do I get to choose any chair? I'll sit here.
Hey.
Hey.
So this QA session will be more like statements from my side, and you just say, yeah, that's right.
Great,
so,
easy, okay.
First of all, in my podcast once, I had a QA engineer. I think it's one of the best QA engineers in probably that I know. But after this episode, I realized that my perception about QA is like totally different. I basically didn't know what QA is. So after your talk, my perception about documentation is like changed completely. Really, it's not what I was thinking that the documentation is.
Hopefully that's still good.
Yeah. So what's the, well, let's not say the worst. What's the best documentation? Something which I forgot to say. We do use Contentful. Thank you. It's awesome product. What's the best documentation that you saw so far? Do you remember about something which was really, really good?
The best documentation. That's really difficult because I think a lot of people really struggle with documentation. So there can be, for instance, pieces that are so great and, you know, really easy to follow, really easy to understand, and then parts that are just kind of like the same way with code, where there's like that kind of black hole that no one really understands and they don't really want to touch, and they're not really sure how to explain it, so it just exists. I mean, you can find that even with, like, within the React documentation. Like, there's some pieces, I can't think of any examples at the moment, you can ask me later, that are just gold, like really easy to follow, really easy to understand. And then parts that are just, like, prop rendering, nah, I'm just not even gonna try.
Yeah, one pattern I noticed is when you have a project like on GitHub, you have like a README page, and if the README is enough, it can be good. But the moment you get out of the README, you have to do something more complicated, then it falls apart. So what you should document? Should I document uses? Should I document methods? Should I document examples? Should I say this is the class, this is all the available stuff? What's the best approach? Should you have like the classical way, this is an object, it has those functions, they do that, or have more use case approach?
Yeah, so I think you can find a balance. So one of the things I recommend is, yeah, explaining the feature and maybe some of the methods you can use with it, or whatever you think is immediately relevant for a majority of the cases. You don't need to cover every niche case. But then going into, you know, some specific use cases just to show, like, here's how you can use this thing, or here's some common ways that other people do. A lot of people have the misconception that if you give people use cases, then they, like, won't use it for anything else except those use cases. But really, if you give people some sort of idea for how to use something, they'll think on their, like, you know, we're creative people. Like, we'll think on our own about how to apply it to our stuff and how to do that. And then, yeah, I always say to put, like, any sort of, like, tooling recommendation at the end, because if you put it too early, it starts to sound a little too much like marketing-y, like, here's our product, you'll love it, here's all the tools you can put into it. Like, it sounds a little skeezy.
Okay. I think we as programmers, we always think about the documentation that something is like, yeah, we have to do it. And at least in the place where I work, we often say, hey, the documentation is a living thing. We don't have to finish it now. We'll finish it like a next sprint. So don't worry, this thing is changing all the time. So what happens when you say that here's the documentation, it's done? What happens after that? Do you have any tips about updating it? Like, you have to go back in a month and see what's changing? I don't know.
I think, yeah, that's also difficult because I don't think there aren't so many companies with dedicated technical writers who can have the time and energy to go do that. But I think anytime you're updating it in any sort of way, if you're adding something new to the feature, it helps to just read through the rest of it to make sure that then you're mentioning that, you know, new feature at the appropriate times, as well as, you know, making sure that it all makes sense together. Because I think what a lot of people do is they'll just plug in that new thing and then not even look at the rest. So
That's exactly.
yeah, and I get it, but it's hard.
Exactly what's happening.
Oh, also Mozilla has really good documentation if you want to.
Oh, yeah.
My favorite, probably.
Yeah, that's a good one. Okay.
So yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And one thing we forgot to mention is that these panel sessions will be part of Notcast episode 15. So no pressure for Krusty to actually publish that at some point next week for my birthday, maybe as a present.